So why don't we go ahead and get started? I would like to introduce Teresa Smith, who is one of the program consultants for the Native American Art Festival, so I worked closely with her throughout the year. And it's her input as well as Joe Baker, who worked with the team with us this year, that really makes it all happen. So I'll go ahead and let Priya give a intro for Miranda, and then Miranda will go ahead and start with the lecture. Thanks for being here today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Teresa Smith. I'm a private member of the Torres Martinez Desert on the east side of the Coachella Valley. I'm also the editor of News from Native California magazine and the California Opinion Publishing Director of Maybe Books. As Julia mentioned, I have the privilege of serving as one of the advisors to the Academy of Native American Arts Festival. And I'd like to take a little bit of time to thank the folks that helped us put this all together, our generous benefactors, the Alpha-Lincoln Band of Kuya Indians, the Kuya Band of Indians, the Chickasaw Nation, the Morago Band of Mission Indians, San Manuel Band of Serrano Mission Indians, San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, Saboba Foundation, and Saboba Band of Laseno Indians, the Tribal Alliance for Southern Indian Nations, and an anonymous foundation. Okay, and I'm so proud to have the opportunity to introduce the talk this afternoon with Dr. Miranda Roberts. Miranda Roberts is an enrolled member of the Arrington Paiute tribe in Nevada, as well as Xicanx. In 2018, she earned her PhD from the University of California, Riverside in Native American history. For the past few years, she has been working as a postdoctoral researcher at the Field Museum of Natural History, where she's developing content for the renovation of the museum's 70-year-old Native American exhibition hall. Dr. Roberts, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm supposed to talk into the mic. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. And first and foremost, I always give a land acknowledgement to the people whose land I am standing on right now, being Kuya people's land, whose prayers, songs, ancestral ways have kept this land and its occupancy since time immemorial, and it's very important for me to honor that and to give them recognition because I wouldn't be able to be here without them. And as guests on their homelands, we must all do our part in respecting their sovereignty and in incorporating their knowledge systems into everything we do. And that is what it means to decolonize, at least from my perspective. So I encourage you all, if you are ever having in the position to give a lecture or give a talk or have a space or an event, to look up whose land you're on and to give proper homage to them, but also make sure that you're doing all that you can to ensure that tribal sovereignty is being recognized within the world that you are living in, and to put that first. And if you don't know whose land you're on, there's this great little app called nativeland.ca. It's not perfect, but it gives you a general recognition of whose land you're on so you can give proper recognition. So I always kind of start any sort of lecture I do by introducing myself, because for me, it's important for you to all understand who I am, the type of work that I bring to the table, and why I am the way I am, or why I'm so passionate about the work that I do. So I am the descendant of Paiute leaders and Chicano activists. In the picture you see here with me, baby Miranda is with my grandfather, who was born in Mexico, but was raised here in Pasadena, California, and was basically always encountered with situations where he was being discriminated against because of the color of his skin. He was also beaten a lot for speaking Spanish at the Catholic school that he went to. And he would always talk to me about the importance of seeking an education and kind of turning the world on its head. He always encouraged me to keep going, to never let anyone take anything from me, and to be proud of who I come from, especially being a brown-skinned woman. The other individual that you see is my great-great-grandfather. His name was Blind Bob Roberts. That's his English name. He was a Paiute spiritual leader. So in our community, we have something known in the broader Western world that is known as the ghost dance. But in our community, it's known as a creation dance. And he would speak to our the best way to translate what he was is he would take messages from the Creator and translate it to our quote unquote prophet, who would then spread the message out to the rest of our community and to other community members as well. I found this picture of him actually at the Field Museum. I didn't know that this existed beforehand. And it was a very big eye-opening experience for me because it kind of helped me reaffirm that that was the place where I was supposed to be. And from him, I garnered great strength and love and pride for being a Paiute woman as well as being brown. In the middle are some of my homelands. That water, this is from a few years ago, so the water is definitely not that high anymore. Yerington is in Nevada. It's closer to Reno than it is to Las Vegas. And this is a little more south, more on the California edge, so almost where more southern Paiute people are from, but we also call this land our home. And this is June Lake. And this is the place where I would go every year, if not more, to fish, to learn about how to take care of the land, and listening to stories from my grandparents. And if you can't tell, all of those things have made me into who I am today. It's a big reason why, as we get into the lecture, you'll see why I fought so hard to make sure Native people were properly recognized in the Field Museum and as well as elsewhere. So this is a picture of the Field Museum's Native American Exhibition Hall when it first opened in 1950. So this hall was opened, and I don't know if any of you are really familiar with the Field Museum. It's in Chicago. It has over 300,000 ethnographic items just from Native North America alone, including over 1,000 human remains, just from Native North America alone. It was collected during the Columbian World's Fair, where Native people were put on display and the progress of America. It was an honor. It was a way of honoring Columbus's quote unquote discovery of America. And the Field Museum, after a lot of things happened in the 1950s, decided to put this exhibition on as a way of, quote unquote, honoring Native peoples who were deemed at the time to be a vanishing race. And as you can see, it was very outdated. Well, even then, it seems highly offensive. And what made it worse was a lot of the items that you see on display may have been from one community or the next. What I mean is there might have been a Kiowa war shirt, but the pants, the leggings were Cherokee. And it was mostly up to the curator at the time. He thought that they looked better aesthetically, so he did that a lot throughout the hall. And he also put up a lot of inappropriate things, such as sacred items. There was a lot of sacred bundles out on display for a very long time, as well as people as figurines, so like mannequins of live people that were made in life cast. And so in 2018, when I was graduating from UCR, the call for a postdoc researcher came up because the Field Museum had gotten enough money to begin renovating this hall. They had been working with some Native artists in the past, such as Chris Papan, a Kiowa artist who lives in Chicago, to kind of do like interventions in the hall, not to take out the full thing, but to really do some interventions to try to bring more light to contemporary Native issues. And finally, they got enough money to create the whole new hall. But in this, what they got this money, it was over $14 million. They were like, we've done enough work with Native people in the past, let's just hire everyone and bring them together. But with that came no real understanding of like some of the harms that the institution had done to Native communities throughout the years, right? So they hadn't really taken ownership of the fact that there were stolen items in their collection, or that there were human remains, or that there were still human remains in other halls on display. And even though there was a Native American Advisory Committee, they still really hadn't thought about like, how do we want to be reciprocal in this relationship that we're trying to build with Native people? When I got there, they thought that just by hiring Native people, a few of us, that they were, quote unquote, decolonizing. But they quickly found out that not all Native people think alike. Not all people have the same opinions. We all have different walks of life. We all have different traumas, and we all have things that we're bringing to the table that are completely different. And that created a lot of controversy at times, because they didn't really think about, when I say they, meaning the institution, really think about how do we mediate these considerations? How do we have people who are maybe trauma informed in these situations? And I was the only Native American person there at the time with a PhD. And there was only 3 other people of color on that same level. And so it created a lot of like hierarchical issues as well, and things that aren't common in Native society about who's more superior than another person, who has more right to tell one story, all those types of things. And so what ended up happening is we were granted a traveling exhibition by an Apsaugad scholar, Nina Sanders, came in and was like, I want to do an exhibition hall on some of the sacred items that we have on display here. And I'll show that really quick. And they were like, great, let's do it. And we did it in 9 months, from 2019 to March of 2020. So our exhibition actually opened March 13th, 2020. And so we actually didn't get to open it until later in the year in November for the full public. But it was during the making of this particular exhibition that we began to realize just how much Native people hadn't really been at the table before at the Field Museum. For example, you see here on one of the main facades of the Field Museum is the name Apsalaga Women and Warriors. Apsalaga are the Crow Nation in Montana, and they're typically known as, people call them Crow all the time. But when we went to go talk to our marketing director about like, you know, we shouldn't call them Crow just because Western society calls them Crow. The people themselves identify as Apsalaga. It turned into a whole big issue about, well, non-Native people don't know how to say Apsalaga, so we shouldn't do it that way. And then I countered with, well, aren't we an educational system? Like, aren't we a place of education? Shouldn't we at least educate them on this, on how to say it? And even if they mispronounce it, at least they're still trying. At least we're giving them the mechanism to try. They wanted to name the show after some of these shields that you see on display, which are considered sacred to the Apsalaga people, that we got permission from community members to put on display, but they wanted to put them, at the time they saw them as like a highlight, I don't use that word myself, of the collection, because there's only so many of these shields. They're infamous in kind of the museum world. And they wanted to put the images of the shields out on display for marketing purposes. But that's not what you do with any sacred material, but particularly these. And so, and then the show was going to be called like Shields of Honor, Shields of different things that had nothing to do with the show itself, which is about how Apsalaga women have always been an important part of Apsalaga culture and continue to be so. And we also learned so I'm co-curating this exhibition while also curating the main exhibition for the exhibition hall. And I'm seeing at this time, oh, they said they worked with Native people, but why are these issues still coming up if they have? We had to convince them to let us take a whole bunch of the staff to Crow Fair, which is the teepee capital of the world in Montana, because we realized that a lot of the staff themselves hadn't actually worked with any Native people. They had only read about them, and they hadn't really engaged in any sort of the cultural elements of the people either. And so we took them to Crow Fair, and we told them not to get on horses, and they did. And like, one of them got bucked off, but we're like, hey, you're getting the experience. You know, we cooked with them. They slept in teepees. We took them to dances. And when we came back, we talked to them about it, and it really did help shape how the story was told, because it was from the curator's perspective. The labels that you would see in this particular hall, which is this particular exhibition is now an exhibition at the Museum of the Rockies, is all told from a first-person narrative. So it's told from the curator's point of view, and she goes into detail about why that particular item is important. And like, there's 3 different languages on each label. So it's English, Crow, and Spanish. And we had to fight for all of those things, because that's not how you typically write text labels. The curator isn't actually at the field, doesn't actually write the text, the developers do, and then you review it and cross it out later. But to have Native people speaking for themselves meant that they had to write the text, and that the text was going to be longer than 70 words. And that sometimes the Apsalaga language has a very long, like it's spelled very long for one particular word, and that has to be okay as well. So I'm learning all of this on top of everything else. And I'm observing, and I'm also observing how maybe conservation isn't really working well with the Native community. Meaning there was a particular conservator there who, for example, I'll use these shields as an example. These shields were meant to be outside. They were taken care of by women. And so, you know, they're all underneath the ground right now. They're not supposed to touch the ground, but then what does it mean to house them underground is a whole other issue. Initially, we wanted these to not have any vitrine around them, because they should be able to breathe. A lot of our cultures, a lot of our cultural items are considered alive, and that they need to be able to fulfill the purpose that they were made for. And particularly these shields are sacred. And I won't go into the reasons why, because that's not I don't have necessarily that permission to do so. But some of the we fought conservation on having those not without a vitrine, because they should breathe. Typically, they would be rained on, and they would be touched all the time, and they would be talked to all the time, and they would be sang to. We didn't end up winning that battle because everyone was really worried about like young people touching them, and they're actually laced with pesticides, because back in the day, our lovely scientists thought that that was the best way to keep them protected. So they're actually poisonous. And so we understood why we didn't do that, but we were trying to figure out different ways of like, how can we ensure that they're breathing in a good way? Lo and behold, actually, one of these shields during the pandemic, during the lockdown, it started, so I was told that these shields bring rain and snow and different weather inclements. During the pandemic, we got a picture from one of the conservators. One of the water pipes above them burst, and a whole bunch of the ceiling fell onto one of the shields. And we were like, we told you they're trying to breathe and they're trying to live. And so, you know, I'm going through all of this, and it's really, really hard. I'm not trying to say that it's easy, because during this experience, I'll get to that pretty soon. But in time, all of those lessons really paved the way for the Native American Hall that I was supposed to be there curating for, really gave a voice to how that was supposed to come out. So a lot of the lessons that I learned during Upsalaga got applied throughout for the Native American Hall. And this one section that I helped curate. I wrote my dissertation on Native American basket weavers, and 2 of them being from Kuya, so Laureen Siskwack, who you may all know, and Donna Largo. And this was my way of giving back to them, because they gave me so much of their stories and of their time that I wanted to put their story out on display for the public to see. And so we worked with Laureen and Roseanne Hamilton on creating this story that gives homage to the way that Native American basket weaving has always taken, or Kuya Native American basket weaving has always been something that women have used to maintain their sovereignty, agency, and as a way to maintain connection to their ancestors. Mostly because when people look at these, a lot of the times they just see art and they don't see the things that really go into them, all of the different stories, the songs, and the women themselves. There's so much history that's just behind these baskets themselves that deserve to be told, and that's what we ended up doing. And there's bird songs that are playing overhead, and it's all giving homage to Laureen Siskwack's particular story of working at Sherman Indian School. And we just opened that last month. So again, the problems that I encountered during this whole both exhibitions were no work was done on acknowledging what does the Field Museum acknowledge being decolonization. We never actually talked about decolonization at all during the making of all of these exhibitions. And they never stopped to help non-Native staff understand what even that word was. It got brought up a lot, right? Because a lot of us as the Native scholars or Native on staff are like, aren't we supposed to be decolonizing? Why aren't you doing this and that? But they're like, but what does that even mean? So we didn't even have an understanding of that. And the worst part for me was having to always kind of go back and forth with non-Native like staff that I was working with at the time to really be like, it kind of fell on me to be like, this is what we're supposed to be doing. And the institution kind of being like, just get the exhibition open, which was hard. And so when I say mostly Caucasian staff without a lot of awareness to the issues Native people are bringing to this line of work, I mean, not really truly understand the toll that it was taking on a lot of our storytellers. This hall is massive. We have over 100 different storytellers from 100 different tribes. And not really understanding that when you're hearing about their resiliency, it's beautiful, but then you're also hearing about all of the trauma that they brought to this work, and how it feels to have like maybe their grandmother's cradle board in the collection and they can't take it home, or the shields and not being able to take them home. And it falls onto staff like me and a few of our developers to have to sit with them daily and talk to them about like how we're trying to make sure that we're honoring them and we're not doing the same thing as the museum had did in the past and making promises that maybe we didn't have the right to make. And then realizing like we shouldn't be making promises, it should be the institution who's making them promises. And having to hold the institution accountable for that type of work. And then mostly for me, what bothered me the most, I will say, is that they didn't really stop to think about what the institutional history was like for Native people there. Meaning when you walk into the field, it's huge, it's massive. It's like a Greek amphitheater almost. It's like an homage, it really is, to Greco-Roman life. And there's different statues everywhere that depict the different sciences, including anthropology. And the statue depicting anthropology is holding a human skull and analyzing it. And I'm like, well, what human skull do you think that they're holding, right? And also realizing that when you come into this space, and a lot of people know the Field Museum, that this particular museum was specifically made, this collection was specifically made because they believed Native people were vanishing. It was really that belief. So they collected everything they could. And that's not a burden, but it's a lot that's carrying on your shoulders day in and day out by consistently acknowledging that as a Native person who has their own set of traumas, that has their own defense mechanisms, that has their own lives, that has their own goals, and having to always confront that on a daily basis about, why are you so worried about a basket? It's just a basket. And then having to re-justify why I'm so worried about a basket, or why I'm so worried about my friends being paid fairly. That was another thing. A lot of unequal pay was happening with our collaborators, so having to ask for more pay. And just really understanding that the museum should take ownership over the harm that it did to Native communities, and having to hold them accountable for that. If you can't tell, I am very boisterous and I'm very passionate about this line of work. And so I wasn't afraid to bring these issues up to staff during staff meetings or in even smaller group meetings, sometimes at large advisory committee meetings, because I felt that as a person, and I go into this here, the questions I really did begin to ask myself early on, especially when I had a group of people coming to me and saying like, we really don't know what to do with this new hall, so we're just gonna use your chapter as a guinea pig. They literally used my dissertation as a guinea pig to see if it could be worked into an exhibition space, which I'm humbly grateful for, and it worked out beautifully, but it just shows you that there was really no point on where to start, and that they relied really on the staff to provide them with the relationships and with the people who we brought in eventually. Most of the staff, Native staff members, brought in like the artists that you would see, like Cara Romero. We have all kinds of Chris Papan, all of those are relationships that we had built over time that we then gave over to the Field Museum, and we're asking them, now what? Now that you have them here, how are you gonna honor them? And they didn't have any answers to those questions. So early on, like I said, as soon as they were like, you're our guinea pig, I began to ask myself, well, what are we doing here? And most importantly for me, how do I want to do this work as a curator? I saw how, and I was being told, like, this is how you curate an exhibition at a natural history museum by a non-Native anthropologist was telling me how to do that. And I respect her, but at the same time, it was like, but isn't this always the same way it has gone? Like a non-Native person is responsible for going into the collection, picking things that maybe look pretty, and then telling a story. Like, isn't there supposed to be more interaction, more collaboration, more trust building if we're really moving towards something that is supposed to be moving away from our legacy as a museum? And then also, what contribution did I want to make to this field? Because you see it, like I just said, you see it all the time. There's curators who do their thing and they're great at it and they tell beautiful stories, and that's not to take away from them. But for me, after carrying like a lot of the trauma, my own trauma from my childhood, and realizing how misrepresentation had taken place in spaces like museums, I wanted to do something that was completely different, or at least trying to push the envelope a little bit. And more importantly, what obligations do I have to my community and those who are represented in those collections? So I don't see myself, I know I have a PhD, but I don't see myself as a person who is above anybody. I was taught from a very early age that how I present myself to the world is something that I'm gonna have to answer for later when I'm no longer here. And my ancestors are gonna hold me accountable. How did you show up? How did you show up for your people? What did you do? What did you do, or what didn't you do? And I had to really sit with that and think about those things. And for me, if you couldn't tell, my family is the most important. The love I have for them is the most important. And the love I have for Native people. I love Native people. I think we're so amazing. And I just want all of us to be treated fairly and with respect, and be paid fairly and on time, and to have more than just land acknowledgement given to pacify or be wary of we didn't do the right thing. I want us to actually have space where we're properly represented and instead of misrepresented. So I had already read, and you don't have to read all of these, but I began to really pull from my reading as just a person who loves to read and as a historian to think about how do I want to shape my curation. And in time, actually, my Instagram handle is curatorial killjoy. Because of this, which loved the Field Museum loved, but the main principles that really stuck out to me during this time that I was like, if this is what decolonization is, and these principles align with how I am, then I'm gonna do the work this way. So Amy Lonetree in her book, Decolonizing Museums, says that a decolonizing museum practice must be in the service of speaking the hard truths of colonialism. The purpose is to generate the critical awareness that is necessary to heal from historical unresolved grief on all the levels and in all the ways that it continues to harm Native people today. That was something I went in right away to the Field Museum. I was like, you need to address how you have harmed Native people and how the display of Native cultures for these past 70 years has been wrong. And because a lot of people love this hall. A lot of Native people loved the hall, and they were very upset that we were changing it. And it's because they grew up going to it. They grew up seeing it. But a lot of Native people from Chicago are like, it doesn't represent me. It doesn't represent my truth. And I told the museum, if we're really gonna own up and really begin to make progress and be a site of education, we should teach people why this happened, when it happened, why these things are here, and how we're working on getting them home. That's even beyond repatriation. And so that didn't go over too well. It did in some ways. The section about repatriation is good, but there is no context to the hall. So there is nothing in the new hall that says why we changed it. It doesn't go and just say, like, we have been wrong for like 70 years. These stereotypes that we helped create are still infiltrating our society, and we need to change it. To me, that would have been a great step forward on at least helping people understand why Native people feel so upset when they enter a museum space like this, and that they're working on changing it. Then I was gifted a book called Living a Feminist Life by Sarah Ahmed, who defined the killjoy greatly for me. The killjoy is one who does not make the happiness of others her cause. When she is not willing to make their happiness her cause, she causes unhappiness. And my killjoy manifesto rests on these principles. And that's not to mean like I'm going around unhappy all the time, right? Or I'm like going around cussing people out. But I was like, when I came to this work, a lot of times it was non-Native women, white women, who were like, I've made my career off of this conservation work, and you're coming in and you're telling me I'm wrong. And I'm like, and I don't appreciate that, and you're offending me. When in reality, what I was trying to say is, well, our Lakota hip hop artist repairs his drum with bear grease, and it's been working for centuries. Why can't we repair this one in the collection with bear grease and see what happens? That's all I was asking. But you know, that's offensive to people because they spend all their lives preparing for this career. The next one is, I can never say her middle name, but Leanne Simpson. I actually don't care if they like me, though I care if they support me. That doesn't matter. It does, however, matter in a profound way what my immediate family and community thinks of me. It does, however, matter in a profound way that other communities of radical resistance see me in someone who has their backs because I have consistently acted in that manner. So a lot of the times our Native scholars, our Native collaborators weren't on the ground with us. They're here in California, they're in Florida, they're in New York, they're someplace else. And I felt like it was my responsibility as one of the Native people there to really advocate for them every chance I got. If they needed money, because they were, a big part of one of the issues was we had people from Montana coming to Chicago to visit the Shields, but they wouldn't, the Field Museum wouldn't pay them to come, they would pay for them to come to the museum for an air trip, but they wouldn't give them an honorarium. Well, I don't know if you've been to Montana, but the prices there are a lot lower than they are in Chicago. And so asking people to buy like 5 nights worth of dinners without giving them any sort of headway is not fair and isn't good. And very elitist, and also making assumptions. And so for me, it was like, it matters to me that the Native people here know that I have their backs. I don't really care if the institution thinks I don't have their back. It's the Native people, because I don't want them treated wrongly while I'm here. And of course, I can't fix everything, but I was always trying to do what I could. And then Audre Lorde was my biggest probably during this time. I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood. My silences had not protected me, and your silence will not protect you. And this was specifically during 2020, after George Floyd was killed. The Field Museum was coming with to us and asking, and other community members, Black community members, like, how do we like honor Black Lives Matter? And it's like, what do you mean, how do you honor Black Lives Matter? Like, show up for the Black community that's in Chicago, like, and show up for the Black Native people who are in Chicago. And not just put a sign on your, and it got to the point where like, we can't publicly make these statements. Our board doesn't like this, or our trustees don't like that, and all of those other things. And so eventually in time, I got sick of it because I was experiencing what I was experiencing day in and day out. And of course, my way of going about things isn't always 100% right, so I had to humble myself a lot. But I decided to transform my Instagram into something that called out the museum in subtle, sometimes unsubtle ways. It depends on what they did that week. But I remember, so this one, I won't go into all of them, but this one on the left, at least on my screen, says, settlers love to talk about how they collaborate with Indigenous people until an Indigenous person raises an opposing opinion. That came up because that main conservator found out I was doing a conference that I was asked for in Canada. It was virtual, about Indigenous conservation, just to give my insights onto what is the benefit of working with conservation from an Indigenous point of view. Not speaking about the science, not speaking about other things like that. I got called into HR, and my supervisor had to sit in the session to make sure that I didn't say anything directly about the conservationists. And so I was like, I'm not gonna say anything in there, but I am gonna call her out on my Instagram. Because I was like, I don't say anyone's name, I never do. And then when it would come back, well, you know, they know you're talking about them. Well, then, okay, then change or do something different. My big one, there is no way to decolonize a museum because, in my opinion, decolonization happened and our landscape is, in some ways, just riddled with colonialism, and we're consistently practicing, and we're not in a decolonial society. We're not there. Maybe one day we will, and I go into that. And the one reason I go into another reason about museums, why I love them so much, is because they are beautiful sites of healing. I have witnessed so many great things happen in museums. From like the war shields, we brought in an elder who whose family owned one of the shields, and he spoke Crow, and he was one of the last in his society. And to be able to hold that shield with him as he's speaking to it and talking to it in his language, and is something that I don't take for granted, and is something beautiful that I don't think collectors anticipated. Well, they didn't anticipate that we would survive, first of all, but we did. And also, though, that they would become sites for us to like get to know people, get to build connections with other Native people, to learn from our ancestors. One of the things that the Kuya basket weavers always teach me whenever I'm in a collection with them is how you can learn about certain stitches and other certain things by just looking at an ancestral piece of basketry, and how important it is to have access to that. I also did more on that. It also led to the birth of this podcast that me and my friend Felicia Garcia, who's Chumash, have, called Exhibiting Kinship, where we talk about the different ways that Native people are working within the museum field to change it. And we talk to Native archaeologists, we talk to NAGPRA representatives, we talk to curators. It's on a pause right now because editing is really hard, but we are dedicated to making it more full-time. And so I kept posting this, and I kept getting in trouble. I kept being killjoy. I really was focused on, at this point, on making sure that the institution that was the Field Museum didn't go around saying, look at all the great things we're doing for Native people, without acknowledging the harm that it was still doing on the inside to Native people. Because I shouldn't have to necessarily advocate for I should have to advocate for myself, but I shouldn't have to consistently go back and forth with people on my own to justify why the Native perspective needs to be listened to. It maybe once or twice. I get that because we're all on a different walk of life. All of us have different experiences. And so people really don't know how to work with Native people. I get that. I have compassion for that. But after a while, it becomes like, are you really just not wanting to work with us, or are you just saying that? Because then it becomes an issue. So in time, I had to do a lot of mediations, and when I say mediations, it makes me look like I'm the bad guy. But it was always about just having people be held accountable. So there was an instance when I hurt a person's feelings because they told me just because I work for free doesn't mean I should expect them to work for free. And I said, I'm not expecting you to work for free. I'm expecting you to anticipate Native people's needs when opening a collection. So like me and my coworker who are Native will come in on the weekends to ensure Native people get access to the museum for free. Why can't collections open collections up for a weekend every month? So Native people who can't be here during the weekday have access. Well, that means we have to work for free. Okay. Well, I'm not asking for a lot. I don't feel like I was asking for a lot, but that got me in trouble. I had to do an apology. It was like this whole thing. And so that's what I'm talking about, is like those issues about where people's own sense of being was coming into place versus the work that they were doing. A lot of times it was like, you don't know how many times I've worked with Native people and they never told me this. Well, we're not all the same. We're not a monolith. There's 500 different nations of us, not including unfederally recognized tribes. And so my curation was mostly, I don't remember a lot of 2020 through 2021 because they still made us work on the exhibition throughout most of the pandemic. So most of the exhibition that opened, was done on Zoom. And I know it's impressive and great, but it took a lot out of us to do that because we're dealing with our own internal existential crises and then also dealing with the museum hounding us like, we're still opening 2021. In 2020, they were like, we're still opening. We're still opening. Up until December of 2020, we were told we're opening in 2021. And so it created a lot of issues for us internally. And eventually, I had to get out of there for my own mental health and for my own well-being. So I left the field, and I still work with them on a contractual basis. But all of this to say is that moving forward, as we all know, institutions are highly influential when it comes to representation. If you go, anytime I would take in like a school group or I'd walk with them, a lot of the kids didn't even know Native people were still alive. And that's because they're being presented with, at the time, presentations of Native people as being in the past. And when they only see us those ways, that's only how they're ever going to think about us. And so if they see us as resilient, as beautiful, as continuing on with our traditions, they're going to start seeing us in that way and then hopefully build with us and work with us on making sure that we're taken care of. And for me, curating is no longer just telling a story that one person wants to have told. So how do we want communities to speak for themselves? How do we make the space to have communities speak for themselves, even if it's stuff that we don't want to, the institution doesn't want to hear? Can I tell you how many times the higher up directors would sit there uncomfortable as Native people are telling them like, your museum did this and this is what you did and you need to own up to it. And they always took it personal, and it's like, it's not personal. We've just been given this legacy and now it's up for us to fix it. And if it's personal, if it's really affecting you that deeply, then that's something on an introspective level that you need to address. And it is our responsibility to make room for those voices in a way that does not place the institution's needs ahead of a community's. So again, working throughout the pandemic, especially when Native communities were one of the most impacted communities during COVID, was, I thought, atrocious and really in bad taste. My friend will tell you, there were times when meetings couldn't happen because one of our Native collaborators was making coffins for his community members. And the museum's like, well, why aren't you talking to so-and-so? And it's like, well, I'm sorry, he's actually doing things that are more important. One of our advisory committee members was the governor for Acoma Pueblo, and he couldn't come to anything, and they were always on him about it. I was like, he's trying to keep his community alive. The museum is not the priority, and that really made me think, then what is a priority, especially as a institution? And I see my role not as a curator, but more as an intermediary, if you will. I like to work with, I understand to an extent not Native culture, but what Native people's needs are. Every community's needs are different. But I like to make sure I'm there with the institution because I also understand what the institution's needs are. How do we bring each other together so they can tell their stories? And the biggest thing I learned is to be bold, respectful, and humble, because you will get things wrong in this line of work. And I have an immense privilege. Something that I've been thinking about a lot is, I have a PhD to fall back on. I have a family. I don't have kids. The work and the things that I say are my acts of activism. And I can say things, and I'm not necessarily, I don't have a job right now. I actually said that this in like 2 years ago. I was like, I don't care if I don't have a job. Like I did the work the way I did it, and now I don't have it, but I'm still proud of this work that I've done. And I don't know what I want to do next, but I do know I want to keep bringing Native representation to spaces that haven't. And for me, being humble means understanding that I might not be able to work in this field, not the Field Museum, but the field, because I have such an activist lens. But to me, I would rather live my life that way than to live, and that's my choice, that's my decision, that's what I'm privileged enough to do. Everyone's activism looks different, but I encourage everyone to think about how they can make room for Native sovereignty in all of the lines of work that they do. Even if it's just writing a letter, maybe if it's even advocating in spaces that you wouldn't usually advocate in, is decolonization is placing Indigenous sovereignty and futurity in the spotlight as the #1 thing and telling the hard truths. And so I encourage all of you to think about that when in any line of work that you do. Indigenous knowledge can be applied anywhere at any time. It's just up to us to make the space for it. Thank you.